The convent of Santa Ines stood as a beacon of faith and devotion for centuries, a sanctuary where young women dedicated their lives to God, embracing a path of sacrifice and purity. Yet beneath the sacred vows and whispered prayers, a chilling mystery began to unfold, one that would shake the very foundations of the church. It started with whispers, a novice feeling faint, another struggling with sudden illness. Then the undeniable truth: several nuns, sworn to a life of celibacy, were showing signs of pregnancy. The convent was sealed from the outside world, untouched by men. How could this be possible? Was it a miracle, a curse, or something far more human? Mother Superior Judith, a woman of unwavering faith and iron discipline, knew she had to uncover the truth. What she would find, hidden beneath the stone floors of the convent, would not only expose a long-buried secret, but force her to confront the very essence of her beliefs. Before we continue, let me ask you this. Do you believe that forced devotion can truly lead to faith? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you're ready to uncover a truth that the church never expected, stay with us. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's step inside the walls of Santa Ines, where faith and forbidden desire collide. Mother Superior Judith had seen many trials in her time. Young novices doubting their vows, crises of faith, the weight of sacrifice pressing down on the shoulders of those too young to fully grasp their choices. But this was something else. It began with Sister Camilla, a gentle and obedient novice known for her unwavering devotion. One morning, as the sisters gathered for prayer, she collapsed. The other nuns rushed to her side, fanning her as her breath came in shallow gasps. Judith ordered her to rest, assuming it was exhaustion. But then came Sister Lucia, and then Sister Maria. At first, Judith dismissed it as a passing illness. The convent was isolated, the stone walls damp with age, perhaps a sickness was making its rounds. But as the days passed, the signs became unmistakable. The glow in their cheeks, the slight swell beneath their robes, the way their hands hovered protectively over their stomachs. And then the realization struck like lightning. It was unthinkable, impossible, and yet undeniable. Judith locked herself in her chamber that night, her hands trembling as she turned the pages of an old Bible. She sought comfort in the words she had known since childhood, but nothing eased the turmoil in her heart. How had this happened? Had the devil himself crept into their sacred halls? Or was there something far more earthly at play? The next morning, she summoned the doctor who occasionally visited the convent. He was an old man, trusted, discreet. Judith asked him to examine the affected sisters, and when he did, his conclusion was one that sent ice through her veins. "They are with child," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. Judith's mind raced. The convent was sealed. The nuns were forbidden from leaving without supervision. The only men who entered were priests and the occasional laborers who tended to repairs. But they were never alone with the sisters. Never. The church had to be informed. This was beyond her power to contain. But even as she prepared to write the letter, something stopped her. A nagging doubt. A whisper of warning in the back of her mind. If word got out, the sisters would face shame, exile, or worse. They would be cast out, branded as fallen women, their faith questioned, their lives ruined. And what if the church saw fit to punish the entire convent? Santa Ines had stood for centuries, but this scandal could bring it crumbling down in an instant. No, she needed answers before she could act. That night, Judith took a candle and walked the dark corridors of the convent. The silence was suffocating, the flickering light casting long shadows against the stone walls. She passed the dormitories where the sisters slept, their breathing soft and steady. She passed the chapel, the scent of melted wax and aged wood thick in the air. And then she heard it, a noise, soft, almost imperceptible. A whisper, a rustling of fabric. Her heart pounded as she followed the sound, her bare feet silent against the cold floor. She reached the old storeroom at the back of the convent, a place rarely used, its wooden door swollen with age. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed it open. At first, there was nothing, just rows of shelves stacked with candles, linens, and aging books. But as she stepped forward, her candlelight caught something strange. Marks on the floor. Scuff marks, as if something heavy had been moved. Judith knelt, running her fingers over the stone, and then, pressing her palm against it, she felt it shift. Her breath hitched. A hidden door. Slowly, she pushed. The stone gave way, revealing a narrow, spiraling passage descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was damp, filled with the scent of earth and time. For a moment she hesitated, but she had come too far to turn back now. Holding the candle before her, she stepped into the passage and began to descend. The tunnel was old, ancient even, lined with bricks, worn smooth with time. She followed it blindly, her heart hammering in her chest. And then, ahead, she saw light. A soft glow flickered at the end of the tunnel. As she drew closer, she saw movement, figures, shadows cast against the stone walls. Judith stopped, pressing herself against the cool bricks. She strained to listen. Voices, and then laughter. She inched forward, peering around the corner. What she saw made her blood run cold. Young men, dressed in the robes of seminarians, sat among the nuns. Some whispered, some laughed in hushed tones, their fingers grazing in secret touches. Others held hands, their foreheads pressed together in tender intimacy. It was forbidden. It was everything she had sworn to prevent. And yet, it was not some dark, sinister plot. It was love. It was longing. It was stolen moments of connection between those who had been forced into a life they had not chosen. Judith's mind reeled. This was no demonic intervention, no divine mystery. These were human hearts, beating with a desire they had been told to bury. She stepped forward, her candlelight spilling into the chamber. The moment they saw her, silence fell like a shroud. The nuns gasped. The seminarians froze, eyes wide with terror. Judith's gaze swept over them, and for a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then she spoke. "How long has this been happening?" A long pause, and then a voice. "For years," a young novice whispered. "Long before we came here, before you were Mother Superior." Judith's breath caught. The secret passage. The hidden meetings. This had been happening under her nose for longer than she could have imagined. She turned to the nearest nun, Sister Camilla, who now sat with tears in her eyes. "You are with child," Judith said softly. "Do you know who the father is?" Camilla nodded, casting a glance at one of the seminarians, a young man barely older than 20. He stared at Judith with fearful defiance, his hands clenched into fists. "We love each other," Camilla whispered. "We wanted to marry, but they never gave us a choice." The weight of those words settled in Judith's chest like a stone. She had spent her life enforcing obedience, ensuring that every woman who entered these walls followed the path set before her. But had she ever stopped to question whether they had chosen that path? Judith looked at the young faces before her, filled with fear, longing, and hope. And for the first time in her life, doubt crept into her heart. Had the church been wrong? Had she? She'd been taught that devotion was a sacred calling, that sacrifice was the highest form of faith. But what if love was not a sin? What if forcing someone into a life they did not choose was the true transgression? She turned, stepping away from the chamber, her thoughts a whirlwind. What should she do? Report them? Punish them? Expose them? Or should she listen? Should she reconsider everything she had ever believed? Her faith had been unshakable. Until now, what would you do in her place? Would you uphold the rules, or would you challenge them? Let me know in the comments. And if you're still with us on this journey, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The truth of Santa Ines is only beginning to unravel. Judith's steps echoed down the stone passageway as she ascended back into the convent, her mind a storm of thoughts. She gripped the candle tighter, the wax melting against her fingers, yet she hardly noticed the sting. Her entire life had been built on a foundation of unwavering faith and obedience to the church, and yet, in the space of a single night, that foundation had cracked. The moment she re-entered her chambers, she sank into her chair, her hands trembling in her lap. She wanted to pray, to ask for guidance, but for the first time in her life, she didn't know what to say. What if the very structure of faith she had devoted herself to was flawed? The faces of the young men and women flashed through her mind, their fear, their love, their desperation. How many of them had been forced into this life? How many had been denied the chance to choose their own destiny? Judith had always believed that devotion, true devotion, came from surrendering oneself completely to God. But was it truly faith if it was never a choice? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "Enter." The door creaked open, and Sister Camilla stepped inside, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She hesitated before kneeling in front of Judith, her hands clasped together. "Mother," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I beg you, do not send us away." Judith's chest tightened. "I have not made a decision yet," she said carefully. Camilla nodded, her gaze desperate. "They will take my child from me," she murmured. "You know they will. They will send me away, and my baby will be raised by strangers." Judith knew she was right. The church had no tolerance for scandal. The sisters who had broken their vows would be expelled, their children placed in orphanages, their lives forever marked by disgrace. Camilla wiped her tears away and looked up at Judith with quiet determination. "Mother, have you never questioned why we are here?" Judith stiffened. "We are here to serve God," she said automatically. Camilla shook her head. "No, we are here because we were told this was our only path. But did we choose it? Did you?" Judith opened her mouth to respond, but the words did not come. Had she chosen this life, or had it been chosen for her? For years, she had convinced herself that faith meant accepting one's duty without question. But as she sat before Camilla, watching the young woman fight for the right to keep her child, a terrible realization settled over her. Faith without choice was not faith at all. That night, Judith did not sleep. She walked the halls of the convent, listening to the hushed whispers of the sisters behind their doors. How many of them secretly longed for a different life? How many were suffering in silence, the weight of her responsibility pressed down on her chest? She had dedicated her life to protecting these women, ensuring they remained pure and devoted. But what if true devotion meant allowing them to choose their own path? She knew what the church would say. She had spent decades enforcing their doctrine. There would be no mercy for those who broke their vows. The punishment would be swift and unforgiving, and if she stood against them, she could be excommunicated, cast out, branded a heretic. Could she risk everything? The answer came to her in the silence of the chapel. As she knelt before the altar, staring up at the statue of the Virgin Mary, a thought whispered through her mind like a divine revelation. Mary had chosen. She had been given a choice. Judith rose slowly, her decision solidifying in her heart. She would not force these women to stay. She would not send them away in shame. She would give them the one thing she had never been given, a choice. The next morning, she gathered the sisters in the chapel. The air was thick with tension. The pregnant women stood apart, their hands resting over their growing bellies, fear in their eyes. The others whispered among themselves, uncertainty rippling through the room. Judith took a deep breath. "I have always believed that faith required sacrifice," she began. "That devotion was measured by our willingness to surrender everything to God." She scanned their faces, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. But I was wrong. A murmur spread through the crowd. The walls of the convent had never heard words like these before. Faith without choice is not faith at all, Judith continued. I will not stand by and watch as you are cast out, as your children are taken from you, as you are forced into a life you did not choose. She took a deep breath. If you wish to stay, you may stay. If you wish to leave, you are free to go. From this moment forward, this convent will not be a prison. It will be a sanctuary. The silence that followed was deafening, and then a single voice. Mother, what will happen to you? Judith met Camilla's gaze. I do not know, she admitted, but I will not allow fear to dictate my faith any longer. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free, but freedom always came with a price. It did not take long for word to reach the church. Within days, a messenger arrived, carrying a letter sealed with the insignia of the Vatican. Judith broke the wax seal with steady hands. The words inside were exactly what she had expected. You have defied the sacred order of the Church. You are hereby stripped of your title and position. The convent of Santa Inés will be reclaimed, and all who remain will face judgment. If you do not renounce your actions, you will be excommunicated. Judith folded the letter and placed it on her desk. She had known this moment would come. But as she walked through the convent, watching the women who had chosen to stay, the mothers who cradled their newborns without fear, the young nuns who had once lived in silent suffering, now laughing together in the gardens, she knew she had made the right choice. She would not fight, she would not beg for forgiveness. She had found her faith, and for the first time, it was truly hers. What do you think? Should Judith have obeyed the church, or was she right to defy tradition? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear how this story ends, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The final confrontation is coming, and it will change everything. The convent of Santa Inés was no longer a place of silent obedience. It had transformed into something else. Something that defied centuries of tradition. The young women who once walked its halls in quiet submission now spoke openly, their voices no longer hushed by fear. Some stayed because they wished to serve. Others left, walking through the grand wooden doors without looking back. But the world beyond these walls was not ready for such change. The church's letter had been clear. Judith's defiance would not be tolerated. The convent would be reclaimed, and those who remained would face judgment. Judith knew what was coming. The evening was cold, the wind whispering through the stone corridors as she stood in the chapel, gazing at the flickering candlelight. She was alone, by choice. The others had begged her to flee, to seek refuge before the church sent their enforcers. But she would not run. She had spent her life enforcing obedience, ensuring that every sister within these walls followed the path laid before them. How could she abandon them now? A knock at the chapel doors shattered the silence. She turned. A figure stood in the doorway, cloaked in darkness. Mother Judith, a voice murmured. She recognized him immediately. Father Gabriel, a man she had known for years, a man who had once been a friend. But tonight, he was not here as a friend. He was here as the church's emissary. You should have obeyed, he said, stepping forward. His voice was not cruel, but there was no warmth in it. You know the consequences. Judith met his gaze without flinching. I do, she said simply. Gabriel sighed, running a hand over his face. You still have time to repent, renounce what you've done, turn over the sisters who have broken their vows, and the church may be merciful. Judith's lips pressed into a thin line. Merciful? She repeated. You would strip them of their dignity, tear children from their mothers, cast them into exile. Is that mercy? Gabriel hesitated. This is bigger than you, he said finally. You may believe that what you are doing is right, but the church is not ready for this kind of change. You are challenging something that has stood for centuries. Judith exhaled slowly. Then perhaps it is time for it to fall. The words hung between them, heavy and dangerous. Gabriel's jaw tightened. Then you leave me no choice. He turned to the door, gesturing with a flick of his wrist. The sound of footsteps filled the chapel as figures emerged from the shadows. Men in dark robes, their expressions hard as stone, church enforcers. Judith remained still. She had known this moment would come. "You will be taken to the Vatican," Gabriel continued. "There you will stand trial for your defiance. If you refuse to repent, you will be excommunicated." Judith nodded once. "If that is my fate, I accept it." Gabriel's expression darkened. "You don't understand. This will not be a simple exile. You will be erased from the church's history. Your name will be struck from the records. You will be nothing." Judith's heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "I have spent my life being nothing," she said. "Now I am something." A flicker of something, regret perhaps, passed through Gabriel's eyes, but it was gone in an instant. "Come," he said, his voice colder now. "Your trial awaits." The journey to the Vatican was long and silent. Judith sat in the back of a carriage, her wrists bound, her mind racing. She had no illusions about what awaited her. The church would not allow her to spread doubt. They would make an example of her. But was she afraid? No. She had lived in fear her entire life. Fear of failure, fear of punishment, fear of questioning. That fear no longer owned her. When they arrived, the grandeur of the Vatican loomed before her, its marble pillars stretching into the heavens. A place meant to inspire awe. A place where men decided the fate of faith itself. Judith was led through winding corridors, past towering statues of saints and martyrs. The irony did not escape her. These walls had been built by those who had dared to challenge the world, and yet they refused to let the world change. The trial was not public. It would not be. The church would not risk the scandal. She stood before a panel of cardinals, their faces unreadable beneath their ornate robes. At the center sat the Grand Inquisitor, a man whose voice carried the weight of judgment. "You have defied the sacred laws of the church," he said. "Do you deny this?" Judith met his gaze without hesitation. "No." A murmur rippled through the room. "You have allowed your sisters to break their vows, to betray their faith. You have harbored sin within the walls of Santa Ines. Do you deny this?" Judith's jaw tightened. "I have allowed them to choose their own path," she corrected. "And if choice is a sin, then I stand guilty." Silence. The Grand Inquisitor studied her for a long moment. "You are arrogant," he said finally. "You believe yourself wiser than the church?" Judith took a slow breath. "I believe that faith cannot be forced," she said. "I believe that devotion must be chosen, or it is nothing but submission." The Grand Inquisitor's expression darkened. "You would rewrite the laws of God." Judith shook her head. "No," she said. "I would remind you that even God gave us free will." A sharp intake of breath from one of the cardinals, a flicker of unease, but the Grand Inquisitor did not waver. "You have been warned," he said, "and yet you persist. There is only one punishment for such defiance." He leaned forward, his eyes cold as steel. "You are hereby excommunicated. Your name shall be erased, your existence forgotten. You are no longer of the church." The words should have felt like a death sentence. But as Judith stood there, surrounded by men who saw her as nothing more than a threat, she felt something else. Relief. She was free. They led her out into the night, the doors of the Vatican closing behind her. She had nothing, no title, no home, no place in the world she had once known, but she had herself. And as she walked into the darkness, she knew that was enough. But what do you think? Should Judith have submitted to the church's will, or was she right to stand her ground? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to know what happens next, be sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The final chapter of this story is coming, and the fate of Santa Ines will be decided. The cold night air wrapped around Judith as she stood outside the towering gates of the Vatican. The grand doors had closed behind her, sealing away the world she had once known. No title, no authority, no home, For the first time in her life, she was no one. She pulled the heavy cloak tighter around her shoulders, her breath visible in the crisp air. The streets of Rome stretched before her, vast and unfamiliar. She had spent decades within the confines of the convent, moving only between the sacred halls of the church. Now, she was a wanderer, but she was free. She walked through the dimly lit streets, her mind racing. What now? Where would she go? Would the sisters of Santa Ines be safe without her? Would the church send more enforcers to silence them? The questions burned in her mind, but she had no answers. Then, a voice. Mother Judith. She turned sharply. A young woman stood in the shadows, half hidden beneath the hood of a tattered cloak. At first, Judith did not recognize her, until she saw the familiar eyes, wide with urgency. Sister Beatrice, Judith breathed. The novice nodded, stepping closer. We have been searching for you. Judith's heart pounded. Who is we? Beatrice hesitated before pulling back her hood. The ones who left Santa Ines. The ones who chose freedom. Judith stared at her. You all left. Beatrice nodded. After you were taken, we knew the church would come for us. We couldn't stay. Some of us found shelter with families in nearby villages, but most of us, we had nowhere to go. Judith swallowed hard. She had expected the church to reclaim the convent, but she had not considered what would happen to those who had defied them. Come with me, Beatrice said urgently. There is someone you need to see. Judith hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Lead the way. Beatrice guided her through the narrow alleyways of Rome, weaving between quiet streets and shadowed corners. The city was a labyrinth of stone and history, but Beatrice moved with purpose. Finally, they reached a small chapel, its wooden doors barely holding against the wind. Beatrice pushed them open, stepping inside. Judith followed. The chapel was dimly lit by candlelight, the scent of wax and old parchment filling the air. And then she saw them, the sisters of Santa Ines. Some knelt in prayer, others sat in quiet conversation. A few held infants in their arms, rocking them gently. Judith's throat tightened. You are all here? A voice rose from the back of the chapel. Not all. Judith turned. An older woman stepped forward, one she had not seen in many years. Sister Magdalena, Judith whispered. Magdalena had been one of the eldest nuns at Santa Ines before she had disappeared years ago. The church had claimed she had been sent on a mission, but now, here she stood, very much alive and very much free. You should not have come, Magdalena said, her voice heavy with worry. The church will not let you go so easily. Judith took a deep breath. I did not come here by choice, I was cast out. Magdalena studied her for a long moment before nodding. Then you understand, she murmured. Understand what? Magdalena gestured around the chapel. That the church does not serve God. It serves itself, and those who defy it disappear. Judith's blood ran cold. You were excommunicated, Judith said. It was not a question. Magdalena nodded. Years ago, I began questioning the same things you did. I realized that faith should not be built on fear. When I spoke out, they silenced me. They would have erased me completely if I had not escaped. Judith looked around at the others. And all of them? Women who were cast aside, Magdalena said. Women who had nowhere else to go. A heavy silence filled the chapel. Judith turned to the gathered sisters. I have failed you, she said softly. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was uphold the same rules that imprisoned us. Beatrice shook her head. You saved us, Mother. You gave us a choice. No one has ever done that before. Judith's throat tightened. For so long she had believed that faith meant unquestioning obedience. But standing here among these women, these mothers, these survivors, she realized something. Faith was not about submission, it was about conviction, and she would not let the church silence them. We cannot hide forever, she said suddenly. Magdalena raised an eyebrow. What do you propose? Judith exhaled. We build something new. A place where no one is forced into a life they did not choose. A place of faith, but also of freedom. A murmur spread through the chapel. "They will come for us," Magdalena warned. "They will not allow this to exist." Judith's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure they have no power over us." Silence. And then Beatrice stepped forward. "I will follow you," she said firmly. One by one, the others stood. Judith felt a lump rise in her throat. She was no longer a mother superior. She no longer had the authority of the church, but she had something far greater. She had their trust. And that was something no decree could take away. The months that followed were filled with quiet rebellion. Judith and her sisters moved to the countryside, far from the church's reach. They rebuilt their lives from nothing, establishing a small community where faith was not dictated by doctrine, but by choice. Women who had been cast out by the church found refuge there. Mothers raised their children without fear. Young girls who once would have been forced into vows were given education and opportunity, but the church did not forget them. Word spread of the heretical convent. The Vatican sent emissaries warning them to dissolve. Letters came demanding their submission. Judith burned them all. Then, one night, riders came. The sisters awoke to the sound of hoofbeats, the flicker of torches outside their gates. Judith stood at the entrance, facing the shadowed figures. Gabriel was among them. "You should have stayed in exile," he said. Judith's heart pounded, but she stood firm. "We will not bow," she said. Gabriel's jaw tightened. "You are committing treason against the church." Judith's voice was steady. "No, I am committing faith." A standoff. Then the sound of doors creaking open. The sisters stepped out, standing beside Judith. Some held their children, others held nothing but their courage. "We are not afraid," Beatrice said. Gabriel looked at them, truly looked at them, and then he turned to Judith. "Do you know what you are doing?" he asked. Judith's gaze did not waver. "Yes," she said. "Do you?" A long silence. Then Gabriel did something unexpected. He turned his horse. "Fall back," he ordered. The others hesitated. "You heard me," he repeated. "Fall back." And just like that, they were gone. The church had not won. Judith exhaled shakily, feeling the weight of history shift. For the first time, the walls of faith had cracked. And perhaps one day they would crumble entirely. But what do you think? Did the church fear losing power, or did they truly believe they were defending faith? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to see how this story ends, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the final moment of Santa Ynez is still to come. The night was still, the only sound the distant echo of hooves retreating into the darkness. The torches had vanished, leaving only the faint glow of candlelight from the windows of the sanctuary they had built. Judith remained standing at the gate, the wind tugging at her cloak, her heart pounding from the confrontation that had just passed. The church had come for them. They had expected submission, but tonight, something had changed. They had turned away. Beatrice stepped beside her, her breath unsteady. "They left," she whispered. "Why would they leave?" Judith's gaze remained fixed on the road beyond. "Because they realized something tonight." Beatrice swallowed. "What?" Judith turned to her, her eyes filled with quiet certainty. "They can no longer control us." The words sent a ripple of understanding through the gathered women. For the first time in centuries, a convent had defied the Vatican and survived. The threat had not vanished. The church would not forget. But tonight they had made a stand, and that meant everything. Months passed, and the world beyond their sanctuary changed in ways none of them could have predicted. Word of the defiant nuns spread like wildfire. Some called them heretics, women who had turned their backs on God. Others whispered that they were revolutionaries, pioneers of a faith unburdened by fear. And then something unexpected happened. Other women began arriving at their gates. Some were nuns, who had heard of their defiance and sought the same freedom. Others were young women who had been forced into convents against their will, hoping to escape a fate they had never chosen. Some were even mothers, abandoned by the very church that had once promised them sanctuary. Judith welcomed them all. The community grew. What had once been a quiet refuge became something far greater, a movement. They planted their own fields, built new homes, established a place where faith was chosen, not enforced. For the first time, prayer was not a duty, but an offering freely given. But the church was watching. A new letter arrived. Judith read it in silence as the others waited anxiously. The Vatican was calling for an official hearing, not a trial, a discussion. Judith lowered the parchment slowly, exhaling. "They want to speak with us." Beatrice frowned. "After all this time? Why now?" Judith met her gaze. "Because they are afraid." The meeting was set in a neutral location, a monastery in the hills outside of Rome. It was a place where negotiations had taken place for centuries, where those who had once been enemies sat across from each other and tried to find common ground. Judith traveled with Beatrice and Magdalena. They did not bring an army of followers. They did not come as revolutionaries. They came as women who had chosen their faith for themselves. The room where they met was lined with towering bookshelves, old scrolls stacked high like relics of another age. At the center sat three men in cardinal robes, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a man with deep-set eyes and a thin mouth, gestured for Judith to sit. "You are Mother Judith," he said, though it was not truly a question. Judith inclined her head. "I was once." The cardinal folded his hands. "You have caused great unrest within the church." Judith met his gaze steadily. "I have given women the right to choose their devotion. If that is unrest, then yes." A pause. Another cardinal, an older man with silver hair, leaned forward. "You have built something outside of the church's authority, and yet you claim to still serve God." Judith's jaw tightened. "Since when does serving God require permission?" A silence stretched between them. Then the third cardinal, the youngest of the three, no more than 50, spoke. "There are those in the church who believe you should be silenced," he admitted, "that your existence is a threat to tradition." Judith did not waver. "And what do you believe?" The young cardinal studied her carefully. "I believe that faith is changing, and that the church cannot stop it." Judith's heart pounded. The eldest cardinal sighed heavily. "We cannot condone what you have done, but neither can we deny that the world is watching." He met her gaze. "You will not be excommunicated, but you will not be recognized either. The church will not bless your community, but neither will it destroy it. A compromise." Judith knew it was the most she could hope for. She inclined her head. "Then we have an understanding." When Judith returned to the sanctuary, the others were waiting anxiously. Beatrice was the first to speak. "What did they say?" Judith looked at the faces of the women around her, the sisters, the mothers, the children, the people she had fought for. "They will not acknowledge us," she said, "but they will not take us either." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some were relieved, others were wary. Beatrice frowned. "Then what happens now?" Judith smiled faintly. "Now, we continue." And so they did. The years passed and the sanctuary flourished. Women came and went, some staying for a lifetime, others leaving to build their own lives elsewhere. The church never fully accepted them, but they never erased them either. And Judith? She never returned to the Vatican. She never stepped inside another convent. She never wore the title of Mother Superior again. But she had something greater than a title. She had faith. Faith in the women who stood beside her. Faith in the power of choice. Faith in something far stronger than fear. Her name would never be recorded in the church's history books, but her legacy would never be forgotten. She had changed the world, one act of defiance at a time. What do you think? Did Judith win, or was this only the beginning of a greater battle? Should faith belong to the church or to the people who practice it? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next powerful story. Because the truth always finds a way to be heard.